took my younger sister on her first backpacking trip in June of 2022. She had never gone overnight and I wanted to get her into it but make the introduction as easy as possible, so I chose part of the Baker Lake Trail, and this is in Washington State. We did a mostly level and easy 4 miles to the Maple Grove campground, which only took about 2 hours. Then we got a campsite right on the shore of Baker Lake, but still partially in the trees. I don't think we could have gotten a better spot because it had a killer view of Mount Baker across the water and there was no one else camping around us. While we were setting up the tent, I realized I had forgotten the rain fly at home. It wasn't the end of the world because the forecast was clear, but I always like to sleep with it on, and that night we only had the mesh roof over us. Not much happened after we got there aside from taking a few pictures and relaxing by the water. Then it got dark and we went to bed somewhere between 10:30 and 11 o'clock. We were also sharing a larger 4-person tent, so we had plenty of room. Right before going to sleep, we were talking and specifically laughing about a wild relationship our younger brother had gotten himself into. Then out of nowhere, something scared the ever-loving crap out of us. In the middle of our conversation, there was a huge flash and it lit up everything inside the tent as well as the trees above us that we could see through the mesh roof. The closest comparison to this flash would be lightning, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. And at the exact same time that we saw it, or maybe a split second afterward, there was a loud pop with a really high-pitched ringing sound. It was so much like a giant version of an old camera flash where you can hear it pop and then there's a high-pitched sound afterward while it's recharging. Except imagine that amplified to 100 times brighter and louder. It definitely wasn't thunder, but it still made us physically jump. I put my shoes on and got out of the tent while my sister stayed inside with the door open. I ended up walking all over our campsite trying to figure out what it was, and I even went down to the water where I could see more around us. The lake was totally calm and there weren't any other people or camps that I could see. I must have stayed out there for at least 10 minutes, but everything was dark and quiet. I can't say we weren't a little freaked out by it, but I eventually went back in the tent and we got to sleep. The rest of this trip was uneventful. The weather was fine, we hiked out the next day and drove home. Other than the flash we saw, it was a normal and easily forgettable night in the woods. Then within that same week, I had a dream about being back at our campsite. It was a really weird one too, because I was hovering above our tent for some reason about 20 feet up in the trees and looking straight down at it. Nothing really happened in the dream, but it lasted long enough to where I was able to look around at the lake and the trail, and I could even sort of see the two of us inside the tent through the mesh roof. When I woke up, it made me wonder why I would have a dream like that. And if that wasn't strange enough, I mentioned it to my sister in a text, and she immediately replied that she had had a dream that week about the campground too. Hers wasn't at all like mine though, with the perspective of floating above the tent. She was just in the tent and we were camping again, but I thought it was a pretty crazy coincidence, and I jokingly told her it was our subconscious telling us to get back outside. Then, just a couple of days after my first one, I had a second dream about the campsite, and I have never thought dreams had any meaning until this one. It was a horrible and disturbing nightmare, and I'll try to include every detail I can remember. It started out the same way, where I was looking down at our tent and campsite from above like I was up in the trees, but I wasn't staying in the same place that time. I was slowly moving down toward the top of the tent. It wasn't like flying because I didn't have any control. It was all happening automatically, and it felt like I was being lowered face first from a harness. I just kept getting closer to the roof of the tent. Then as I came down, everything started getting brighter, like it was turning into daytime, and I could see myself and my sister through the mesh. It looked like we were both lying inside and sleeping, but it was hard to see at first. As the light got even brighter, I remember consciously realizing it wasn't daylight I was seeing. I was watching the flash we had seen in real life, but it was happening at this ultra-low speed while I moved toward the tent. Then I got to a point where I was so close I could have reached out and touched the mesh fabric, and I could see both my sister and me inside perfectly. When I looked at us lying there in this out-of-body experience, we were next to each other and flat on our backs, staring straight up at the roof of the tent. It looked completely unnatural, and neither of us would ever sleep that way. Right after that, I got so close that my face was actually up against the mesh and I could look through it to clearly see our faces. We both had our eyes wide open and they were completely white, like thick cataracts were covering them. I couldn't see our irises or pupils. They were just this horrible cloudy white color, and the two of us were staring straight up without moving. Seeing this was absolutely terrifying, and it instantly woke me up. I have had some pretty bad nightmares in my life, but never anything close to this. Even when I picture it now, it makes me kind of sick because we honestly look like corpses laying in the tent, and it was the single worst dream I've ever had. My sister was equally creeped out by it when I told her, too. The part that bothers me about this experience is that there really was a bright flash while we were camping, and I don't understand why, because there wasn't any weather or clouds around us. Lightning doesn't even seem remotely possible. It also doesn't make sense that my sister had her own dream about being back at that campground before I'd ever even told her about mine. I think that is incredibly strange. And finally, I don't know why I would ever dream about the two of us lying there with our eyes all white and gross like that. I don't think I've ever had a dream outside of that one where I'm actually looking at myself, because that alone is so weird. The reason I wanted to share my story here is because I've started to believe something happened to us in that fraction of a second during the flash we saw. In the moment, I didn't even think to check for lost time, so I don't know if we experienced that or not. We obviously didn't have a direct alien encounter like a lot of other people, but I feel like there's more to our camping trip than what we remember, even though I don't want that to be the case. In 1980, I had an experience where I saw something that I couldn't identify, and I think it affected my family as well as other people around us for miles. This all happened in the state of New Mexico while I was in the bed of a pickup truck and we were driving west on Highway 40 from Texas to California. I was 13 years old at the time, and my mom was leaving a domestic situation I won't get into, so she and my brother and I were leaving Texas. This was pretty late at night, and she was driving our truck with my little brother next to her in the cab. I was in the bed of the truck on blankets with all of our stuff under an old camper shell that our neighbor had given us. I had my back against the cab with suitcases and a few bags of stuff going down each side of me, but I did enjoy looking out the back window and watching the road behind us. This canopy also had side windows that I could see out of as well, and none of them were tinted like today's canopies. They were all larger with clear glass and metal frames. My mom's truck didn't have a sliding back window, so if I needed anything, I had to knock on the glass to get her attention. I don't know exactly where we were when this happened, and I've tried to find the location along Highway 40 on a map, but I was just too young to remember. I really only remember that it wasn't too far from the Arizona border. Somewhere along that section, we passed a large butte that I could see out of the side window on my right side, so this would have been on my mom's side of the truck and south of the highway. When I first saw it, I could immediately tell there was something on top of it or above it, and it made me lean over the bags to get my face close to the window. At the very peak of the butte, there was an extremely large gray object that I could really only see half of. From the road, it had the appearance of a long rectangular platform, and it reminded me of something made out of Legos, as funny as that sounds. I'm really not exaggerating when I say it was huge, because it stretched out over the whole top of the butte. If the sun had been out, it would have cast a shadow over most of it. I did not think this was anything alien at the time because I didn't know any better. For whatever reason, I was thinking a giant plane, even though it wasn't moving, or maybe something they had built on top of the butte like a concrete lookout, which again would be impossible to make something that size. I never would have thought that now, but I was young and I had never been through New Mexico, so I just didn't know. Right about the time when the highway was at its closest distance to the butte, something happened that I've never been able to explain. While I was still leaning over the bags with my face at the window, I felt the truck stutter like we were running out of gas. Then my mom pulled over and stopped on the side of the highway, and I could tell it was dead. Then I heard her get out of the truck and open the hood, which has always been a funny detail to me since my mom would never know what to look for on an engine. I stayed in the bed of the truck but opened one of the side windows so I could yell to her and ask if everything was okay. The only answer I got was a very frustrated "I'm working on it." We didn't have any other conversation, and I was going to ask her to look at the butte, but she was in front of the truck so I couldn't see her, and she didn't seem like she was in the mood to talk. Maybe 2 minutes into our breakdown, I heard the hood shut and my mom got back into the driver's seat. Then I heard her trying to start the engine again, and it hesitated a couple of times but finally started, and after that the truck sounded fine. I know nothing about cars, so I couldn't even begin to diagnose what the problem was. The entire event only lasted 3 or 4 minutes though, and we were back on the highway. As we got up to speed, I looked toward the butte because it was right next to us, and I saw that this huge object was actually moving. I could see it backing away from the highway and going toward the other side of the butte. This was not an illusion caused by us driving away from it or anything like that. I am 100% sure it was floating away from the road, and while I wasn't able to see where it ended up going, by the time we got a mile or two down the road, it was far away from where it had originally been. Then I noticed another thing as we kept driving. We passed 2 or 3 other cars that were stopped on the shoulder, and one of them was pulling back onto the highway like we had done. Then when we got even farther down the road, there were several more cars along the oncoming side doing the same thing. At the time, it didn't register with me, but years later I realized how unusual that was. It looked like many other vehicles had pulled over or stopped on the actual road, and they were just getting going again like we were. I couldn't even talk to my mom about any of this until we stopped, which we finally did at this tiny town in Arizona. I will always remember the place because we stayed in a roadside motel that had all of these concrete teepees for rooms. It was actually a pretty cool and quirky motel. When I finally got the chance to tell her what I had seen, she really didn't have the time or energy for it, and she never took me seriously. I can't fault her for that at all though, because we were in the middle of a really rough time. But basically, I never got a chance to talk about it with anyone, so I ignored it for years. As I got older, I started to wonder what had actually happened, because I don't think our truck was the only vehicle on the road that night that just quit working. It was like that huge object above the butte had affected everyone on that stretch of Highway 40 for a brief period of time. I also understand that I was young then, but I was still old enough to comprehend and remember everything pretty clearly, and I know this is what happened. I always told myself that someday I would drive that route again just to see if I could figure out where the butte was and where we broke down, but I've never made it back. I really wish we had had the technology back then that we do now, because I could have researched online for news articles or sighting reports or something on social media. Unfortunately, none of that existed back then, so the chances are slim to none that I'll ever figure it out. This happened about a week after the 4th of July, 2024 in Portland, Maine. My boyfriend and I had gone into the old port early one morning to get breakfast, and while we were walking around afterward, we noticed an unusual ship sitting in the harbor. It was a government ship called the Empire State, and it stood out to me because I had only ever seen cruise ships come in during the summer. I was still pretty new to Portland at the time, so I could be mistaken, but it immediately caught my attention. We spent most of that day walking around downtown and exploring, so we weren't really in a hurry or doing anything in particular. As the day went on though, I started to notice a lot of unmarked and debadged SUVs driving around that area, and most of them had New York license plates with the exception of a few from Massachusetts. By the afternoon, we weren't just seeing a few either. They seemed to be everywhere we went, and it was enough that we started to feel like something was going on. It just felt like they were there for a reason, and it put both of us on edge. At one point, we mentioned it to someone working in one of the stores, and surprisingly, they had actually noticed the SUVs too and agreed that it wasn't normal. We tried not to think too much about it though, and we finished our day downtown. Later on, when we were back at our hotel and just before midnight, my boyfriend and I decided to take a walk because it was so nice out, so we went over to the North Street Community Garden on the east side of town. We both love this spot because it's high up on a hill and you can see almost the entire city of Portland and all of Back Cove from there. It's especially beautiful late at night when everything is quiet. We brought a couple of drinks and a thick blanket with us and laid down in the grass, just enjoying the view and the cooler air since it had been such a hot day. I remember feeling so happy looking up at the sky and not wanting to be anywhere else. After about 10 minutes on the blanket, I realized that my boyfriend had fallen asleep, but I was still wide awake and not even tired yet. At that same time, I started to feel this vibration, and it felt like it was in the air and coming through the ground simultaneously. The best way I can describe it is like a hum going through my whole body. I could feel it in the parts of me that were touching the ground and also in the parts that were out in the open. It really started subtly, but it kept getting stronger and louder until it was an actual sound that I could hear with my ears as much as I was feeling it physically. It turned into something that I couldn't ignore at that point. Then as it got even more intense, I could feel a full-blown panic attack coming on because I didn't know what was happening, so I started violently shaking my boyfriend and telling him to get up. He mumbled something at me and barely opened his eyes, but then he looked out in front of us over the water and immediately sat straight up and said, "What is that?" I hadn't seen this because I was looking toward the city, but there was something in the sky that I have never seen before. It had these lights underneath it that seemed to be getting brighter the longer we looked at them, and there's really no other way to say this, but it looked like a UFO. I'm only using that term because I can't imagine anyone calling it anything else. It didn't have the shape or the characteristics of anything I've ever seen. It was also sitting perfectly still right at eye level with us on the hill, and we had a solid 30 seconds to look at it. Then, without making a sound, it dropped straight down and went into the water. I didn't think about this until after the fact, but when it hit the water, we didn't hear or see a splash, and it should have made a huge one. It somehow just avoided physics and smoothly went into the water. Within seconds of this happening, we heard car engines starting right behind us. Then we saw 3 of those same unmarked SUVs drive away in a line and at a pretty fast pace. The weirdest part about it is that I had no idea they were there. We didn't see them when we showed up, and I never heard anyone pull up or park while we were on the blanket. That fact still creeps me out because I don't know who they were, how long they were there, or what they were doing, and we would have been in plain sight where we were sitting. As soon as those SUVs were gone, we got up and went straight back to our hotel. I don't know if this has anything to do with what we saw that night, but the very next day, and in the morning even, that government ship was gone from the harbor and we didn't see another unmarked car that entire day. My boyfriend and I are convinced that we witnessed an incredibly special aircraft that was either classified and being used by the military, or it was something with unknown technology that they were tracking or monitoring. I can only believe it was the latter since it seemed to break at least some of the laws of physics. I can't even wrap my head around how something that large could fall into the water and not make a massive and loud splash. It seemed to be completely unaffected by the surface of the water, and it went right through it. The first question I get when I tell this story is, why didn't you take any pictures or videos? The answer to that is simple. We didn't have our phones on us. Both of them were in the car, and we simply didn't have the time to run back and get them. It was literally a 30-second thing from start to finish. This might sound stupid to a lot of people, but personally, I am glad we didn't jump up to get our phones because we would have missed the most incredible part. That was when this amazing and unidentifiable aircraft dropped into the water. Seeing that is something we will never forget.